Have you ever had somebody tell you a story, and while they're telling it, you're thinking, that can't be right? You know, our children are very adept at this, aren't they? You know, they don't want to get in trouble, so they tell the story of how it happened, and it's just not quite what it's supposed to be. And so we understand sometimes when people have doubts, when they don't get everything that we're trying to get to them. And for some, the story of Jesus and the cross is just too preposterous to believe. That God would take on flesh, voluntarily allow himself to be executed just so that he could raise from the again, is just the stuff of legends and myths. And yet, despite all these objections, Paul doesn't shrink back from preaching a crucified Christ. And he wants for us to examine the evidence based on faith. And so he begins with the apparent contradiction. He says in 1 Corinthians 1, starting in verse 18, "For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but for us who are being saved, it is the power of God." The cross was repugnant to ancient sensibilities. You know, consider the story of Jesus, that he came to save people who rejected him. He was deserted by his disciples, and he was officially strung up by the authorities. And so for the ancient world to believe that a Jewish carpenter in the backwater Providence is the Lord of all and Savior of everyone was just a little bit more than ancient sensibilities could really comprehend and understand. Christianity was cradled in what appeared to be complete defeat. However, for the believer, the cross demonstrates the power of God. The gospel transforms the image of the cross from a means of Roman terror and execution to a symbol of God's power and his love. And that it demonstrates how deeply concerned God is for us. That Jesus' defeat of death by his resurrection demonstrates how God will continue to operate in the world. The cross continues to be powerful. It continues to transform lives. It continues to save people. And it continues to defeat evil. And so for Paul, there were only two types of people in the world. Those who were in the process of being saved and those who were in the process of perishing. What makes the cross even more offensive is that it's not simply the foundation of redemption, but becomes the way of life for believers. That Jesus does the exact opposite of what people expect. Victory comes through defeat. That Jesus sets forth that the highest principle in calling is humility and service, not power and prestige. And so Jesus calls his followers not to be victorious in their own life, but rather to give up their lives, to deny themselves, to take on the shame of the cross, and to be willing to live for Christ. And so the cross challenges our very notion of the value of personal gratification. And to those who respond to the cross in faith, it is the evidence of God's power. The cross is not simply about death, but it's about what God did in order to defeat the human condition so that we could be in relationship with him once more. That it requires a radical reversal of the way that we think, and that we reprioritize our own lives to live it in conformity with the sacrifice that has been made for us by Jesus. That the fullness of salvation awaits the one who will persevere in their faith and remain faithful until the end. And so Paul brings forth his claim. He says, "For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has God not made foolish the wisdom of the world?" Paul's point is that God makes the worldly wise look like blundering fools. Isaiah is writing to a group of people who are afraid of the Assyrians. And so the logical human thing to do is to align yourself with another power who will come and protect you. And in this particular case, it was the Egyptians. And so all the leadership in Jerusalem said, well, this is what we need to do to stay in power, to protect ourselves. But God had a different plan in mind, a plan of weakness. He was telling the people, don't trust in Egypt, but rather trust in me. And allow me to rescue you from these forces that are opposed to you. See, all human schemes fail because they fail to take into account the power and action of God. The prophet seeks to remind us that the Father is the creator of all humans, and as created beings, we fail to fully appreciate the power and majesty of our God. Amen. Paul asked, where are all the perceived professional experts of the day? He goes, it's impossible for them to be honest about searching for wisdom when they do so through the limitation of human wisdom. That they think that they are smart unto themselves, that they are intellectually superior. And so the notion that victory could be obtained through defeat is totally contrary to them. And so they reject the premise from the very beginning. But this is why Jesus can call the poor, the lame, the broken, the downtrodden, the persecuted as blessed, because they're the ones who actually recognize God for who He is. And they're willing to accept the gift that He has given them. The wisdom of the cross is that we learn to let go of this world. The Apostle Paul will later argue that this world is passing away. It is beyond redemption. It is beyond correction. And so the wisdom of the cross is to teach us to let go of this world and prepare ourselves for the world to come. And that through that, we will find abundant and true living. Therefore, God made the wisdom of the world foolishness. Wisdom, human wisdom, is fatally flawed because it is based in human conduct. It is twisted by the preference of wanting to promote self over others. At its core and at its center is a competitive, self-serving outlook that runs counter to the message of the cross. Have you ever come across an expert who didn't think that he knew everything there was to know? And yet when it comes to the cross, it's about humility, not about what you know. It's about acceptance, not about trying to convince people. But the world can never come to understand God through its own wisdom. He writes in verse 21, for since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. See, understanding God has nothing to do with intellectual knowledge because it's God who reveals Himself to us. Humans didn't begin a quest to discover God and miraculously found Him. But rather, God revealed Himself through His actions of history, and that should have proved to them that not only was God real, but that He was the creator of all and therefore worthy of their worship. Therefore, it pleased God to save us through the foolish act of preaching. Well, see, preaching is foolishness because of the message. The message of the cross is to give up and to turn yourself over to God, to no longer protect yourself, but we be willing to protect others. But the message of the cross is also foolishness because of the one who delivers it. Now, I don't want you to think of me as being foolish, but the idea is that I don't present my own message, I present God's message. Amen. Therefore, anyone who comes to believe don't come to that faith because of me, they come because of the message of the cross. Amen. And what God has brought out and what God has given to us. And so such foolishness reveals that it is God and His power that is truly at work. But the world wants convincing proofs. So he says, for the Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greek, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. See, God doesn't offer sensory spectacles or irrefutable proof. You know, the Jews were always seeking a sign, and Jesus gave them the greatest sign there ever could be, his resurrection from the dead. But they rejected the sign, therefore they rejected Jesus. They were looking for the very thing God provided for them, but they refused to accept it as truth. He says the Greeks seek intellectual superior knowledge. You see, they saw things through this prism of everything had to have this logic and sense. And it doesn't make sense for the creator of the world to send his son to die for people who are ungrateful. Therefore, they rejected the message. And so it was through their own unwillingness to accept what was given to them that they refused to believe. So Jesus became a stumbling block to the Jews, because they couldn't comprehend the idea of the Messiah being willing to die rather than being victorious. It became utter foolishness to the Gentiles. They laughed and scoffed at the idea of the cross being the means of victory for all of us. See, for those who think that God must be mighty and strong in order to be victorious, the cross just proves all of that completely wrong. But while the message of a crucified Christ trips up some, and others, it is a recognition of the truth. The gospel message is the exact opposite of what people want and expect. You know, we expect victory to come through self-will and determination. You know, if you watch the commercials online about losing weight, you know, how do you lose weight? Well, it's through your effort and your determination. You buy this program, you follow it, you'll be successful. The cross is the exact opposite. By giving up everything, you'll gain everything. Well, that's not true. Oh, by being willing to conform your life to Jesus and living counter the culture, you'll gain life. Well, that's not true. And so it completely goes against everything that culture puts out. But for those of us who believe, it is the power and wisdom of God. See, the gospel message is available to anyone who believes. You don't have to be rich. You don't have to be powerful. You don't need to be the intellectual giant of the day. You just simply need to have faith. You just need to simply believe in the message in order to gain all that it has to offer for you. And that the cross can transform our lives. Paul concludes his thoughts. He says in verse 25, "For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men." See, the manifestation of God's power and wisdom is to be seen in the crucified Christ who died to save the foolish and the weak. Believers trust that God accomplished something through the cross. That we believe that he brought about reconciliation between us and the Father. And that through that we can have the abundant life that God has promised us. That God's power and wisdom does something remarkable. It takes people who are flawed and makes them into a community. That God's power allows us to exist in a community where we belong to one another. We belong to God. We find strength and encouragement in that. And so it helps us to be the very people God calls us to be. That the cross stands as the final denial of all human attempts to obtain salvation. See, you can't obtain your salvation through yourself if you believe in Jesus and the cross. Because you've got to rely on him in order to help it to come about. That yeah, we have our part to play. We've got to be willing to submit in faith and in trust. But we recognize that we're weak and powerless without him. And that we need him above all else. The message and power of the cross still confounds the world today. You know, we are told that we are foolish for believing that a Jewish carpenter who died over 2,000 years ago can still save us today. We are told that we are foolish to believe that he was resurrected from the dead and that one day he will come back to take us home to be with him. We're told that we are foolish to believe that if we that not only will we have an abundant life now, but the promise of the eternal life to come. And Paul wants to encourage us to not let our faith be shaken by their ignorance or by their arguments. That we don't get bothered by the fact that they say that they can prove that Jesus never died. That we don't get all upset when psychology comes and says, well, believing as a Christian is just, it hampers you, it makes you a worse person. Because we find our clarity and focus on our God and our faith in Jesus. That we hang on to our faith no matter what and know with confidence that God will reward that faith. See, the intellectual people of the world, God says they're foolish. Because when they speak and they say there is no God, they have told you everything you need to know about them. And that if someone wants to argue that Jesus didn't die on the cross, that believing him is foolish, that what we need to understand is that in reality, they are the ones who are foolish. Because the power and wisdom of what God has accomplished in the cross is bringing us to salvation, and it will bring anyone who is willing to follow it to salvation as well. I want to encourage anyone this morning who is not a follower of Christ to become one. To believe that Jesus is indeed the resurrected Messiah from the dead. That we place our faith and our trust in him, that we conform our lives by repenting of our past actions, that we take him on in the waters of baptism so that we're raised to a new life, a new beginning. But I also want to encourage those of us who've already made that commitment, don't allow yourself to be convinced that anything other than what Jesus has told you is the truth. Because they're out there. And there are plenty of people who think they know better than all of us. Well, don't be bothered by their arguments. Because they're not the ones who are mighty and powerful. Our God is. And our God has promised that those who live in faith with him will always be with him. So if you need to respond to the invitation in any way, I want to encourage you to do that while we stand and sing.